It was November 29, 1943. The cold air over Europe was thin and biting, and the roar of hundreds of engines filled the sky. In the tail section of the B-17 bomber, called Ricky Ticky Tavy, tail gunner Eugene Moran sat hunched over his guns, eyes scanning the endless blue behind them. More than 300 American bombers were in the air that day, their mission to strike Bremen, a city bristling with defenses and home to vital German industry. The crew knew this wouldn't be an easy run. Bremen was one of the most dangerous targets in Europe, and the Germans would throw everything they had to stop them. With just 10 minutes left before they reached the bombing point, the atmosphere inside the bomber was tense. Every man in the crew was alert, scanning the skies, hands close to their guns. Then, over the crackling intercom, the call came sharp, bandits, 12 o'clock high. The German pilots had studied the bombers well. They knew that if they attacked head-on, they could avoid the worst of the defensive fire from the top and bottom turrets. A formation of twin-engine Messerschmitt, Bf-110s appeaed in the distance, flying directly toward them. These weren't just armed with machine guns and cannons, they carried a terrifying new weapon. Strapped under their wings were massive 21-cent rockets, designed to rip apart bomber formations before the fighters even got close. Without hesitation, the Bf-110s fired. Thick trails of smoke marked the rockets as they sliced through the air toward the American bombers. In the cockpit of Ricky Ticky Tavy, 21-year-old pilot First Lieutenant Linwood Langley barely had time to register what was happening before one rocket shot past the nose of his aircraft. Missing by what felt like inches. "Did you see that, tail?" he shouted over the intercom, heart pounding. Off to the side, one of their fellow bombers took a direct hit. Flames erupted from its wing, and it began to fall away from the formation. The moment the rockets were spent, the Bf-110s kept coming, now opening fire with everything they had. Bullets and cannon shells tore through the air as the German fighters roared past. Navigator Second Lieutenant Jesse Orzen swung his side-mounted gun toward one of them and squeezed the trigger. Tracers streaking into the enemy plane. At the tail, Moran's twin .50 caliber guns thundered as he tracked a fighter and riddled it with fire, forcing it to break off. The German formation split into pairs, each banking hard away into the distance. But there was no relief. Squinting at the far edge of the sky, Moran spotted more specks growing larger. "More. 5 o'clock. High," he shouted. The specks quickly became shape-sleek Bf-109 fighters and the dreaded Focke-Wulf 190s, nicknamed butcherbirds for their ruthless reputation. They dove in from above and behind, and in seconds the sky turned into pure chaos. Bombers and fighters weaved in and out. Tracer fire crisscrossed the air, and the constant rattle of machine guns filled the ears of every crewman. Empty shell casings rained onto the floor of the bomber as every gun on Ricky Ticky Tavy fired at any target that appeared in range. The intercom was alive with overlapping shouts, gunners calling out enemy positions, others claiming hits or kills. 3 o'clock hike coming in fast. "I think I got one. Watch your lefties diving." Ahead of them, a German fighter suddenly erupted in flames, spiraling down toward the clouds. But there was no time to celebrate. The sky was now thick with black bursts of exploding flak shells from 88mm guns far below. Some German fighters pulled away, unwilling to face both the bombers' guns and the flak. Others pressed the attack, weaving through the explosions to keep firing on the formation. The bomber shuddered violently as blasts went off all around. In every direction, the air was filled with shrapnel, smoke, and the flash of explosions. Several American planes took direct hits. One's tail section tore away entirely. Another dropped out of formation, trailing thick black smoke before rolling over and plunging toward the earth. Inside Ricky Ticky Tavy, the order came over the intercom. "Prepare to drop." Langley's voice was steady but urgent. "Yes, sir." "Bomb bay doors opening," replied the bombardier. The long, groaning sound of the bomb bay doors filled the aircraft, and the men inside braced themselves. Everyone waited for the lead bomber in the group to release its bombs. Once it dropped, they would all follow. "Just drop them already," someone muttered under their breath, impatience cutting through the tension. Finally, the call came. Bombardier Donald Sess pressed the release. A deep metallic clunk echoed through the aircraft as the massive bombs fell away into the city below. The bomber suddenly felt lighter, rising slightly as the weight left. The doors slowly ground shut, and Langley banked the aircraft, turning them toward the long journey home. The flak fire began to fade, the black puffs in the air slowly disappearing. Langley called for a damage report. "Navigator here only, a few holes in the wings and fuselage. Nothing serious. Engines look fine." Langley let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The B-17 was living up to its reputation as a flying fortress. All 4 engines still roared smoothly, and for a moment the crew felt a wave of relief. They were battered, but they would make it back. That hope lasted only seconds. Before the sound of their own voices could fade, another urgent cry tore through the intercom. "Bandits!" They came again, dropping out of the cold sky like a wave of dark, fast-moving predators. From high above, a swarm of enemy fighters closed in, their silver wings flashing in the sunlight as they dived. The shout went through the intercom yet to the guns. Inside the bomber, every man froze for a split second, eyes fixed on the endless stream of aircraft coming toward them. The sight was enough to twist the stomach. These weren't just a few German planes, this was a full assault. They had returned, in force, determined to repay the Americans for what had been done to Bremen. The order to open fire came fast. The heavy pounding of the .50 caliber guns shook the airframe, their rapid thuds blending with the deep, cracking booms of enemy cannons. Each impact against the fuselage made the bomber shudder. The sky ahead lit up with streaking tracer fire, bright flashes, and bursts of smoke. Fighters swept in from every angle, 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, from above and built the air into a three-dimensional battlefield. Fortresses were going down all around them. Some burst into flames, spinning toward the earth, trailing black smoke, while others broke apart in midair, pieces tumbling away. But the men of Ricky Ticky Tavy were too busy to watch. Gene swung his guns toward an FW-190 that roared past, pressing the triggers until his barrels glowed. The fighter shot out of view, and almost instantly a Bf-109 flashed by. He fired again, not stopping to see if his bullets had struck home. There was no time to celebrate hits or mourn misses. An other target always appeared seconds later. Too high. Watch it, someone yelled. Gene's whole body jolted as the bomber shook under another volley of enemy fire. Slowly, almost without him realizing, the plane began to lose speed. The main formation moved ahead, the gap growing with every passing second. Gene looked over both shoulders. There was no smoke, no obvious damage to the engines, yet the separation widened. Alone, a B-17 was easy to pick apart by faster, more maneuverable fighters. The intercom crackled with worried voices. "We're falling back, what's going on?" Langley. Still nothing from the cockpit. Gene pressed his own mic button, shouting, "What's wrong?" "We're not keeping up with the formation," but the only answer came as the gap became impossible to close. "We're being pushed out." The voice was calm, but it wasn't clear whether it came from the captain or the co-pilot. In moments, Ricky Ticky Tavy was on her own in the wide, empty sky. The German fighters noticed immediately. They broke away from the larger battle, forming up to target the lone bomber. The attack came hard and fast. The rattle of enemy guns mixed with the shouts and groans of the crew, men being hit in their positions. Still, the bomber flew steady, holding its altitude, but the silence from the cockpit was chilling. Gene would later say very little about what happened next. Even in interviews, years afterward, his voice would falter, and he would change the subject. But the account in the book, Tailspin, written by one of his closest friends, filled in the details. From below the bomber, in the cramped ball turret, Wilbert Pee Wee Provost, Gene's best friend, yelled out, his voice shaking, "There's one coming right at us." A moment later, panic filled his tone. "He's coming up from below, he's right on us. Buddy, I'm done." Gene shouted for him, desperately scanning for the threat. Then the sound of bullets striking the bomber rang out snarp. Metallic cracks followed by the splintering of the plexiglass dome below. There was a scream over the intercom. A twin-engine German fighter suddenly shot up past the tail. So close Gene could see the pilot's face for an instant. His fingers tightened on the triggers, and his twin .50 calibers roared to life. The tracers connected, tearing into the enemy's fuselage. Black smoke poured from the stricken plane, and it fell out of sight. Pee Wee's voice never came again. Then, from the corner of his vision, Gene saw a Bf-109 pull up alongside the bomber. He swung his guns toward it, but the Germans stayed just outside the arc of fire, clearly knowing the B-17's blind spots. For a few seconds, they flew almost level with one another. Through the glass, Gene could see the enemy pilot clearly calm, focused. The German lifted one hand from the controls and pointed directly at Gene, then downward toward the earth. Gene stared back, not moving. The gesture came again, slower this time. It took a moment for Gene to understand the German was offering him a chance to bail out. Was he the last man left alive? Had the others already jumped or been killed? The sky around them was strangely still for that moment. But in the distance, Gene could see more German fighters circling, watching. His mind spun through the possibilities. Jump, and maybe live as a prisoner. Stay, and likely die. But before he could decide, before he could even move, the uneasy silence shattered. Somewhere, above, a burst of gunfire cracked through the air, ending whatever fragile truce had just existed. Someone on Ricky Ticky Tavy was still alive, still holding on, still firing at the Germans. Whatever small choice Gene had left to make was gone in an instant. A German Bf-109 turned sharply and disappeared, and that was all the opening the enemy needed. The German planes swarmed in like vultures, circling prey, ready to finish the job. In the tail section, the air suddenly became a storm of flying metal, shredded fragments, and sharp pieces ripping through the air. Gene was thrown hard to the floor. His ears rang, his head swam, but he somehow forced himself back to his position. He tried to return fire, but nothing happened. His guns had jammed. It was as if his body switched to autopilot. Despite the burning pain from his injuries, his hands automatically began working on the guns. His vision narrowed, his breathing was ragged, but he clung to hope as he managed to get one gun working again. Just as that small glimmer of hope appeared, more enemy bullets tore through the plane, ripping into Gene himself. He cried out in pain, a sound of both agony and frustration, as both of his arms were struck. Bones cracked under the impact, both arms were broken. But even with his arms shattered, he refused to stop. He somehow managed to squeeze off a few more desperate rounds before another burst of gunfire tore into him, slamming into his chest and breaking several ribs. The tail gunner's position was now a place of utter destruction. The air smelled of smoke, hot metal, and blood. The plane lurched violently, shuddering in what felt like its final moments. Gene felt himself being pressed deep into his seat as the aircraft dropped sharply, spiraling downward. He reached instinctively for his parachute, but it had been shredded. By gunfire, he remembered there was a spare chute stored near the tail wheel. But in that moment, he could see some of the crew lying nearby motionless, lifeless. A deep, tearing groan filled the air as the plane's structure gave way. Gene could feel the floor under him shifting, almost pulling him backward. He grabbed onto anything solid, his fingers aching from the strain. Suddenly, the sky appeared in front of him as the fuselage ahead broke away from the tail section. He was now completely separated from the rest of the aircraft. Clinging to the floor of the tail, he pushed himself down with every bit of strength he had left, screaming in pain inside his oxygen mask. He could only watch as the main body of the Ricky Ticky Tavy dropped away, leaving him alone in the tail section. In the forward nose section, Navigator Jesse Orison and Bombardier Donald Curtis were still firing at the endless wave of enemy planes. There were too many, and they were too fast. Bullets struck the plexiglass, hitting Curtis and forcing him back into Orison. The plane was already in a steep dive. Orison struggled with Curtis's limp body, managing to get a parachute strapped to him just before the plexiglass nose shattered completely. The force threw Orison from the aircraft, jagged shards slicing into his legs as he tumbled through the freezing air. He pulled the ripcord while screaming in pain. As he floated downward, he spotted the tail section spinning violently far below him, the rudder and elevators flapping wildly as it fell. He had no idea that his friend Gene was still inside. 3 people on the ground later swore they saw the tail fall, and some even claimed that Gene kept firing his gun while spinning through the sky. But Gene himself said that wasn't true. Inside the tail, the spinning was relentless, the G-forces crushing him into place. He couldn't move, the air pressure pinned him, and a red haze filled his vision as blood seeped into his eyes. The fall seemed to last forever. When the tail finally hit the ground, it smashed through the trees with a violent force no living person should survive, but Gene did. Through blurred, damaged eyesight, he thought he saw a faint light ahead of him, almost like a tunnel. He crawled toward it despite the agony in his broken arms and the strange loose feeling in his teeth. Inch by inch, he moved, and then, suddenly, he was falling again. The next thing he knew, he was lying on a forest floor. Above him, the tail section of the Ricky Ticky Tavy hung precariously in the trees. He just lay there for a moment, shocked, and almost euphoric that he was alive. Then the pain returned, sharp and overwhelming. He reached up with his broken arms and felt the side of his head. There was a crack in his skull so large he could feel the soft, unprotected gap beneath it. Soon he heard voices. He braced himself. Fearing the worst, he had heard stories of locals who sometimes took brutal revenge on downed bomber crews. But to his relief, the voices were speaking French. French workers from a nearby labor camp, along with several German soldiers, arrived and found him. They dragged him roughly through the forest and brought him to a camp. There, a Serbian doctor operated on him, placing a metal plate in his skull to protect his exposed brain. Gene's wounds weren't only physical. While recovering in the hospital, he was haunted by recurring nightmares of falling through the sky, screaming. Time passed, and slowly, Gene recovered enough to be moved. After the war ended, he was released and sent home, reunited with his closest friend and the only other survivor of the Ricky Ticky Tavy, Jesse Orison. Many years later, in 2022, 8 years after Gene's death, his friend John Armbruster published a book called Tailspin, telling the incredible story of Gene's survival. It's a gripping read and one worth recommending. As for the legend of the ball turret gunner who fell without a parachute and lived, that's a story everyone should hear, and one that deserves to be seen on film. Gene's story is not just about surviving the impossible, it's about the unshakable will to live, even when every force around you is trying to end it. His courage under fire, his refusal to give up despite shattered bones and devastating wounds, and his return home after enduring both physical and mental scars show that the human spirit can endure far beyond what most would believe possible. Tales like his remind us that in war, heroism is not only in victory but in survival itself, and that sometimes the most powerful battles are fought not in the air, but in the heart and mind.